As a gay man, there's not a country that's run by Muslims which I could live in. One of my best friends is in hiding again tonight, Dayan Hassi Ali, because of what she says, and she'd be killed if she went to any Muslim country. And I think that matters. And I think the way in which this affects our personal lives does matter, and we should not ignore it. We have the great blessing of living under this system, and we take it for granted, and we spit on it, and we can because we're living in that freedom. But I beg you, ladies and gentlemen, not to pretend that that means that we shouldn't assert the superiority of that system, because that is what it is. It is a superior system. It doesn't, I would stress this, it doesn't have to be violently asserted. Rights and values are not asserted by violence. They are asserted by showing people your rights. They are shown by example. If you do not speak up for your rights, if you do not say that you think that the rights that you enjoy should not be enjoyed by other people, or people with darker skin, or people in other countries, then I submit that you make a great error of judgment.
It is also really a privileged position to stand here and say that there are citizens in this country by virtue of their ethnic origin who can have their citizenship withdrawn from them. It is
there is something
it's
nothing to do with ethnic origin.
It is a racialised conception of citizenship that says that you can take away people's citizenship.
No, that is completely
their origins are not native.
That is completely unacceptable. We're talking about behaviour.
Can I ask? The only reason that we can consider taking away his citizenship is because we do not regard him as fully British, and that is a racialised conception of citizenship.
If I could just correct that.
Correct me, would you?
The problem about what Miriam's just said, among other things, is you can do the thought experiment another way. Let's say a pseudo-state was set up in another country in the world.
It's not a state.
I know it's not a state, you know it's not a state, they think they're a state, they call themselves a state, and a lot of people who burn their passports or go over to fight for them believe they are a state. Let's pretend another pseudo-state was set up from any other religious or other kind of background. If people from Britain were going to that state of any background or any origin, and they were cutting off people's heads and raping women and children and so on, I think this country would take a rather tough stance about it. And I think, among other things, one of the things we would look at was withdrawal of passports, among other things. If you say you are signed up to this appalling state, then maybe we take you at your word.
Miriam's case is there is a racial element.
But there should not ever be. But I think something Miriam said that we really must come back on is that somebody is not considered fully British.
Absolutely.
You are either British or you're not.
Well, then you can't withdraw somebody's citizenship. They're British citizens and we have to deal with it.
If I can say so, not only has it not got anything to do with race, but the bit that Miriam has not mentioned, which it has a very great deal to do with, is religion. This has a great deal to do with religion, and we have not so far discussed the religious aspect of this, because Islamic State calls itself Islamic State for a reason. They follow certain principles, misguided in your opinion, misguided in my opinion, but certain principles that they say they derive from Islam.
All right,
and any discussion of this has to take them at their word to some extent.
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting that we would sort of try and essentialise Islamic State. They're very much like any cult or, if you like... I think you can
look at their origins.
If you compare them to any sort of cult or gang, there are usually some similarities with the broader concept from which they are derived. So you get cults that are derived from Christianity. Sure. Very similarly, you would say that Daesh or Islamic State is derived from Islam in some way. Yeah. But I think the problem is to take things at face value and to certainly to corroborate their narrative by accepting their view that it is a state and that they have the legitimacy to call themselves Islamic. It's problematic.
The Waco group in Waco some years ago, everyone was interested in the religious claims they were making when they decided to become this millenarium crazy cult. If I can just finish. This is a crucial thing we cannot avoid. I know it's uncomfortable, I know we want to keep avoiding it, but the religious aspect, which Miriam didn't want to talk about, is a vital part of this discussion. And it's reliant upon Muslims of all kinds to take that on and tackle it.
Mr. Ramadan then went on, and I think this is an important thing to talk about, to immigrants. He did exactly the same thing that Mr. Glass did. He treated us as a society as if we were a society that just abuses immigrants, that imprisons them, locks them up. I don't know where he gets that from. I see immigrants all across our streets, many of whom are doing very well. Most people in Britain have welcomed them. There hasn't been mass violence against these immigrants. By and large, they have been welcomed. How does that happen? How would the reverse happen in Saudi Arabia? How would the reverse of that happen in any Islamic culture? Why is it that every Jew in the Middle East has had to go to Israel? Why is it that we have made the de facto agreement that if there is to be a Palestinian state, it has to be Judenrein, clear of Jews? Because we treat them by a different standard, ladies and gentlemen, and we know it, and we will not do what we need to do, which is to say this is what works for us, and this is, we believe, what could work for other people. Mr. Ramadan said that we need dialogue. I agree. Everyone agrees we need dialogue. But where does it start? Would it start, for instance, with making a joke, contra Mr. Khomeini, not a very funny man? Or would it start with an article, perhaps? Would it start, perhaps, with a film? It did, a few years ago, with Submission, and Theo van Gogh was killed. Could it start with making a joke, perhaps? A joke in a cartoon? Well, apparently not, because we know that there were burnings and killings and lootings and riotings across the globe in reaction to those cartoons. If you're going to start a dialogue, what could you do that would be smaller than drawing a cartoon? If anyone has an idea, please let me know. But this dialogue, which we keep on being offered, is not reciprocated. And we can have the dialogue here, in the West, tonight. But how many of the countries that will be talked about by the other side could we have the same dialogue in? We get to discuss our failings because we are in the West. We get to analyse our failures because we are here. And I think that matters.
All right, disagree more. I'm elated by the death of Osama bin Laden. As I think any decent person should be. I think this doesn't demean America. It reminds people of who has been right in this conflict, who the victim is, and who the perpetrator is. Osama bin Laden did not allow any of the 3,000 people in New York and Washington on 9/11 any rights. He took away every single right that any of the people in those cars or their families had. He didn't grant any rights to the families or the victims of the 7/7 subway and bus bombings, which he inspired. It went on, and it's a good thing that the story has now finished. It was military forces that were sent into that compound, and soldiers are trained to fight, and they're trained to shoot and to kill. And if this had been a police operation, then we would have sent police in. America would have sent police in. Pakistan would have sent some police into the building. But it was Osama bin Laden. They knew it wasn't a police operation. It was an army operation. And in an army operation like that, it's very likely that shooting is going to occur, as it did from both sides, apparently, and that somebody's going to get killed. But I just want this absurdity of all the time of treating people who have broken every single aspect of the rule of law, who then, when they're killed, suddenly all of these people come out and say the rule of law must be applied to Osama bin Laden. We have to remember who the victim is and who the perpetrator is in this. Yasmin says about, we must show, as it were, our principles. We must show that we're better than them. We are better than Al-Qaeda. We don't have to show that, Yasmin.
No, you do.
Hang on, Yasmin, just wait a second. But the point is what Yasmin is doing, and what many people are doing at the moment, is holding America and our allies to such a uniquely high standard that no society could ever live up to it. That even the worst enemy of a society has to be buried according to the customs that they would want. You know, I can't raise it in me, Yasmin, to think that whether or not the customs around his burial were perfect in your eyes is the most important thing in the bin Laden story.
Then you are as barbaric as them.
Well, we're not as barbaric
you are
as them.
as barbaric
Of course we're not. What? Because we don't do the exact Islamic burial, we're as barbaric. It's as if we'd flown planes into buildings. This is moral relativism gone mad. It's worse than moral relativism. It's an inversion of morality.
You can't choose your morality. Bits. You can't choose bits of it.
Well, you do.
I don't.
You do, and you decide to apply moral norms to societies that you dislike, which you wouldn't apply to others.
I'm critical of all people who behave barbarically.
And some worse, some more than others, yes.
No, it's not
some worse than others.
The great disappointment of the last 14 years has been that civil society has failed, that we can't do the things to the Islamists that we would do, as I referred to the neo-Nazis. You know, we just not, it seems we're not set up for it, or people don't have the guts and the balls for it. They just, you know, they fear being called a name more than anything. And, you know, the thing I've always said is, we'll win when an Islamist who is not breaking the law but is saying horrible and hateful things is treated in the same way that Nick Griffin is treated. That's when we'll win. You know, because we all recognise he has a right to freedom of speech and so on and so forth, and if he's not breaking the law and it's a legal party and so on. But, you know, we don't invite him to loads of places. The Quakers don't host Nick Griffin, you know, to have Q&A sessions. You know, the Methodist Church doesn't celebrate the political thought of Nick Griffin. You know, the Anglican Church doesn't have hymn sheets that promote things that Nick Griffin thinks. Of course not. We know what to do with those types of fascists. But societally, we've totally failed to understand, to even recognise, and then to deal with this type of fascism. It's a magnificently terrible failure, and we're reaping the rewards. So we have to wake up to this.
Well, let's take it like this. Thanks to the Archbishop's comments, if he saw what he wants to see, a Muslim girl born in this country would, because she was born to a Muslim family, be treated in her courts, in Sharia courts in this country, as being worth half the worth of testifying of her non-Muslim neighbour. That is what would happen. We would be ghettoising people into implying that if you're born a Muslim, you will be run by Muslim law. If you're born a non-Muslim, you'll be run in the normal way that everyone else in the country is. The Archbishop, who it's extraordinary we've got to this stage, but the Archbishop, in promoting Sharia law, apart from the fact he should resign, has made life incredibly difficult for progressive Muslims in this country who want to object to Sharia, and he's made it vastly easier for the extremists to see there's something they can get if they hold on long enough. No, this is not to do with the 95% of Sharia which its apologists say is not to do with hand chopping. The issue of Sharia, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but if you're dealing with Sharia in this case, it is dictated in the Quran, in the second book of the Quran, that women are worth half that of men. Now, if you want to have a parallel legal system in this country which throws out the rights accomplishments of this country, runs roughshod over them, and decides that women are worth half of you, then I resent the fact that you're trying to speak for anyone, let alone Christians.
Have you actually read the lecture, and did you see in the lecture?
I read the lecture, and I found out what I could from it, and I listened to the interview he gave, in which, might I add, in his interview, he said that it was wrong that everyone should be treated under the same rule of law in this country. He said that there were problems from that. I don't think there are problems from that. I think that's one of the best accomplishments we've got, that everyone is equal before the law. And the head of your church is saying that it should be different.
You are doing, Mr.
Do you think it's Islamophobic to point out that we think that women should be treated equally to men?
Let me finish. Let me finish. The people should understand, and our fellow citizens should understand, that the Muslims are not asking for a parallel system, and there are many interpretations relating to Sharia, and it's much more open than that, and don't come with something which is a superficial discourse. I'm sorry to say,
Suhaib Hassan was on the television last Sunday night.
Not acceptable.
Last Sunday night, Suhaib Hassan from the Islamic Sharia Courts of Britain was on the televisions across this country on Channel 4 saying that he would like in the end for people to be flogged, beheaded, hands chopped off, all that stuff. We know that's where it leads, Mr. Ramadan. We know where it leads.
You are just using the controversy to spread fears in the British society.
There is a good reason to be fearful of Sharia, Mr. Ramadan.
You don't have to go very far in Britain, or the West in general at the moment, to find people's unwillingness to assert the superiority of their values. But they know the superiority of their values because they live with the superiority of their values. I talk at a lot of campuses, and I was at one last night in London where a student got up and started protesting because I had said that an Islamist government was of itself a bad thing, which I think it is. I just said to this student, and it's not a hard question you'd have thought to ask, I just said, well, name me one Islamist government state that you would want to live in. And this is a serious question, ladies and gentlemen. It is also a personal question, and one which, if people were honest, they would admit is personal. As a gay man, there's not a country that's run by Muslims which I could live in. One of my best friends is in hiding again tonight, Dayan Ali, because of what she says, and she'd be killed if she went to any Muslim country. And I think that matters. And I think the way in which it affects our personal lives does matter, and we should not ignore it. We have the great blessing of living under this system, and we take it for granted, and we spit on it, and we can because we're living in that freedom. But I beg you, ladies and gentlemen, not to pretend that that means that we shouldn't assert the superiority of that system, because that is what it is. It is a superior system. It doesn't, I would stress this, it doesn't have to be violently asserted. Rights and values are not asserted by violence. They are asserted by showing people your rights. They are shown by example. If you do not speak up for your rights, if you do not say that you think that the rights that you enjoy should not be enjoyed by other people, or people with darker skin, or people in other countries, then I submit that you make a great error of judgment. Mr. Glass treated us to a textbook example of Western masochism. And I know some people in the hall enjoy that, because some people laughed and clapped when he cited Western civilization and epitomized it by what? World War, Nazism, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. Ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that the West should be treated and regarded only as something which is treated by its lowest moments, and believe that all other cultures and all other civilizations should be treated only by their highest moments, you're already putting in an unequal challenge here. But in Iran, when a couple was shot the other week for holding hands when not being married, the courts congratulated them. Ladies and gentlemen, it does not need you to want to assert your morals violently, to say that that stinks, and we will not be a part of it.
Douglas Murray, he's a best-selling author and founder and director of the Center for Social Cohesion, also a citizen of the United Kingdom, a member of the Church of England. Until recently, you said that your study of the Quran, you said this in print, made you an atheist.
That's right. I said Muhammad made me an atheist. The publisher said at the time, that's a pretty provocative headline. I said, well, get somebody to do the next one. She said, I could find a Catholic who could say Muhammad made me a Catholic. I said, how about trying to make it a three-part article and get a third one, somebody saying Muhammad made me a Jew? And that one would be the trouble.
Douglas Murray, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm sorry to make this panel rather Brit-centric after my colleague Majid. This isn't an attempt by us to have a British takeover of the old colony or anything like that. But I was coming earlier from my own fallen empire, referring back to my friend and colleague Ayan's comments earlier, and I was reading the paper, as I'm sure all of you were doing earlier today. Majid finished his comments by talking about the importance of changing paradigms. I'm not sure this is about paradigms. I think it's about facts. Here are some facts in my newspaper earlier. The Times Square bomber, of course, a man just up the road from here who tried to kill thousands of people. Only, by the way, didn't manage it because he set the 24-hour timing device to 7 a.m. instead of 7 p.m. 1900 hours was what it was meant to be. If he had have got that bit right, thousands of New Yorkers would have died earlier this year again. I see further in the paper 12 suspects arrested in France in a network trying to recruit people to go and fight American and other troops in Afghanistan. I turn to another page of the newspaper, and the city I've just flown off from this morning, a Muslim London Underground worker who was, had written to his wife, who was off to try to become a martyr for Allah, as he says. He says, more than anything, I wish Allah to grant me martyrdom. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at facts. We should also just quickly, if I may, refer something to the wording of tonight's debate. Ayan's already mentioned this, but I mean, let me put it this way. You're I'm sure, a liberal-minded New York audience, or at least I hope you are. We'll see. But I imagine that if the motion we had here tonight was Christianity is a religion of peace, we get to the Q&A, perhaps even before, and somebody would say, if the other side were arguing for that, somebody would say, what about the Crusades? What about that? And then there'd be some other clever clogs who'd say, what about that Florida pastor the other week? That was a nasty business. That's Christianity for you. If we'd had tonight, Judaism is a religion of peace, the other side were trying to argue that. Sure as anything. There'd be people popping up in the hall tonight saying, oh, there's this bit in one of the Old Testament books, really, really bad. All sorts of massacres going on. Why don't you talk about that? There might even be people trying to say that, the argument that Judaism was a religion of peace couldn't be argued because people would say, look at what Israel is doing, and isn't that a direct response, and so on. So let's not have a debate about Islam and whether or not Islam is a religion of peace without talking about the facts to do with Islam. It's an absurd situation we're in, where nothing that anyone does whilst being Muslim is any responsibility of Islam's. Yet anything anyone does whilst being a Christian or a Jew is responsibility of all Christians, all Jews. Let's make this as straightforward as I can. Take the categorization that eminent scholars like Bernard Lewis, Ibn Waraq have made. Let's say Islam is a very, very complex thing. And the best way I can do this in the very short time I have is say you have 3 Islams. Islam 1, 2 and 3. Islam 1, the Quran and the life of Muhammad and the Hadith. Islam 2, the tradition of the Sharia. Islam 3, what Muslims do now. The first of those things, Islam, the Quran and so on, is bad. It is bad. There is a lot of violence in it. And what's worse, the peaceful verses are superseded by the violent verses. The violent verses also, sadly, are more numerous in number. Then you've got the life of Muhammad. Again, a bad man. A very bad man, it has to be said. Not a great role model, if you look at it. Takes child brides, abuses a small girl, multiple wives, himself a warrior, himself a war criminal, himself beheads Jews. This, I would have thought, would be a signal of not great peacefulness. Then you've got the tradition of the Sharia. Again, not great peacefulness. Still, no schools of Sharia that people in this hall would want to submit to. And thirdly, what Muslims do now. Thankfully, there is some hope in that one. Because most Muslims, thank goodness, I almost said thank God, but old habits die hard. Most Muslims don't do what those texts say. Because they exercise their judgment as moral beings without having to refer to defunct holy books. Now, look, I wish that Zebra and Majid were the spokespeople of Islam. It would be lovely, although in Majid's case it would have taken rather too long if everyone had to go for 14 years preaching the downfall of America and then said, no, not so much. But we are where we are. Anyhow, I wish they spoke for Islam. It would be great. But the fact is that tonight, the organisers of this debate asked a number of clerics. None of them would show. Specifically, they wouldn't show and debate against Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Myself, I don't think they cared. But no, it's very interesting that they will not debate. Time and again, the actual leaders of your religion will not debate this. And you're left with people like we have here. The reason why is, of course, is that the leaders of the religion show such terrible lessons. It is not a small thing. It's not, as it were, a detail. It's not like a wacky Florida pastor. That you've got the largest Sunni state of Saudi Arabia, the most important Sunni state in the world, the most extraordinary closed prison of a society. It's not a detail, it's not a one-off nut job that the Shiite Republic of Iran is what it is, led by the people it's led by. That is not an accident, it's not a detail. The thing that worries me is that although tonight we hear from the fellow panellists here about how Islam is a religion of peace, the fact is that the people who are making the decisions in the religion, the people who are preaching the religion, the heads of that religion, people like Sheikh Qaradawi, who broadcasts anti-Semitic, the most appalling filth every week on the main networks, that is the faith that's speaking for you guys. I wish that, Zeba, you were on every week on Al Jazeera, but you're not. Qaradawi is. The problem is that Islam is an unstable component. As a religion, an unstable component. 1,000 years ago, the Mu'tazilites tried to reform the religion. They were wiped out. The fact is that Islam is many things, many, many things. But to say it's a religion of peace is nonsense. It's to ignore reality. It's to ignore very difficult but necessary facts, not